I get hundreds of phone calls a month and thousands of comments on social media about, John, I'm looking to buy a PowerStroke 6.7. What is the most reliable year model that Ford has made? There's 5 generations out there and we've got them all lined up, and I'm going to go through all the mechanical details. You already know what options they have, but the mechanics are the hard to know. We're going to go through the good, the bad, and the really ugly. So we have 5 generations of the PowerStroke 6.7. We have the 11 to 14 model. We have the 15 to 16 model. We have the 17 to 19 model, we have the 20 to 22 model, and we have the 23 to current year model generation. We had the 7.3 that was in production for close to 10 years, and then we went to the 6 liter, which we all have our horror stories on those. We thought we were making a big improvement going to the 6.4, which I drove a 6.4 for 280,000 miles, but there was a lot of problems with it, and Ford fixed it all in-house by developing their own engine, the PowerStroke 6.7. The first generation, 2011 to 2014, was the biggest improvement to diesel engines in the Ford lineup. So it's interesting, this truck originally came out with 390 horsepower, 735 pounds of torque. You could start buying these things around October, November of 2010. Now come August of 2011, GM had produced a Duramax with slightly more horsepower, and so Ford actually dropped programming that you could go back and retroactively increase the horsepower to 400 and 800 pounds of torque. So in August, all production vehicles were coming out with that new increased horsepower and torque levels. So if you're looking at buying one of these trucks, here are the things that we're going to find under the hood that could be problematic. So I have many customers that have over 500,000 miles on these engines, but on the first 6.7, the biggest failure point on these engines were the turbos. So they had a very small turbo that had to work extremely hard, and that thing was a twin scroll. So essentially it had an upper intake and a lower intake. The lower intake would go into the front of the turbo, the upper intake would go down to the back side of the turbo, and essentially it was like 2 compressor wheels inside of one housing. Now that really small compressor wheel, the problem with it was 2 things. One, over rotation. So a lot of people were tuning these trucks, and with tuning, you would over rotate that turbo. It would get the bearings hot and smoke the bearings. They had a ceramic bearing in them, ball bearing, that turned out to be a failure point on these. A lot of people went through many, many turbos. So if you're looking at purchasing a 2011 to a 2014, here are the items that you need to address. And if they're not already addressed by the previous owner, make sure you have some money set aside to do it. First is going to be the turbo. I would upgrade this thing to a 15 or 16 model turbo, or go aftermarket with like a KC turbo, something else besides that factory turbo. You will have to address the intake manifold is going to be slightly different, as the piping that goes to that turbo will have 1 inlet versus 2. Second problem that we found years down the road were the crankcase filters, which were doing a really good job of filtering those crankcase gases and separating the oil. The problem was they would clog up, and that would cause increased crankcase pressure, which would lead to upper oil pan leaks, front cover leaks, and those things are expensive to repair. So make sure you have an updated crankcase filter. If not, double check for oil leaks, because you may have a $5,000 or $6,000 repair if that thing had not been changed and it's leaking oil. Now, as far as the engine design, they did a phenomenal job of creating their own in-house engine, but it came with some learning curves. So one of those being the valves on the heads were having problems with overheating, and that was due to an issue with the regen process. Essentially, the injectors would inject fuel on the exhaust stroke. That diesel would go through the exhaust valve, through the exhaust manifold, and into the DPF filter. And what we found was it was overheating some of those valves. Those valves were cracking and dropping and damaging the engine. Now, as far as a percentage of those that I saw come in for repair, it was probably 5%, but that is still a big number. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at these. Otherwise, the truck is pretty solid from front to back. The next item I would look at is the fuel system. So when these trucks were brand new, the first 100,000 miles, the fuel system was fairly robust, but the thing that it lacked was a good fuel pump and filtration system. So I would definitely upgrade that factory fuel pump, which is located in front of the tank. It's going to be right here underneath the driver's side seat. Upgrade that with something like a fast fuel system. It's going to filter better, it's easier to service, it provides better low pressure fuel. It also has a better air and water separator on it. Because the number one problem with these, everybody talks about the CP4 pump, and the reason the CP4 pumps would fail on these was lack of fuel filters and air getting into the system. So the pump is sensitive, and if you contaminate the fuel pump does not like the contamination. The injectors in these did not like contamination. They have a very small tolerance for debris going into the fuel injector. pressure, and so you could cause problems with the engine by not supplying adequate fuel, clean fuel, and fuel without air. Another one of the items that was very common was for the charged air cooler tube, this boot to blow off. So it was not uncommon for the little casting mold right here to get hot and blow out, get a coolant leak. There was no check engine warning light. These things would get hot and blow out. So I'd recommend updating this with either the charged air cooler tube off one of the newer models or going with an aftermarket kit like an S&B to make sure you don't have an issue there. And if you're finding a great deal on one of these and you've saved up the money to bulletproof one, it can be an extremely reliable engine in the end. Upgrading the fuel system, the turbo, if you have it in your budget, replace that CP4 with a DCR pump and you'll have a great long-lasting vehicle. Some really big improvements they had on these that were reliable. The transmissions were solid on these. The rest of the powertrain was really solid. The bodies are extremely solid. There's very few body issues and internal component issues that we see on these trucks. So it was interesting to know that Ford produced this truck knowing they could get more power out of it, but they just gave us enough power to beat the competition. But as soon as the competition had the upper hand, they quickly came back at it and said, hey, we have plenty of capacity left in this powertrain. We're going to bump those numbers up just a little bit more. Now, we spent 4 years working on this motor, and typically a year or two into a new engine, you start finding where the weak points are. We found out those problems really quick. Technicians and dealers reported those back to Ford, and we came out with the second generation of the 6.7. So the body was essentially the same. There were some minor updates inside the cabs. I do like the cab configurations on the 15 and 16 models a little bit better, the dash layout and some of the extra features, some additional trim level options. But the biggest improvements were right here under the hood. Transmission, axles, suspension, all that stayed relatively the same. So several of the weak points on the first generation were notated and they were fixed on this second generation. So you're going to find this second generation on the 15 and 16 model Power Strokes. So Ford added 40 more horsepower to take this thing to 440 and 60 more pounds of torque to take it to 860 on this second generation. With the additional horsepower, they had to make the engine stronger. So many of the internal components are extremely upgraded. Probably the biggest jump on internal strength from the first generation was to the second generation among any other generations that we produced after this. And the biggest improvement specifically was the turbos. We went to a single scroll turbo. It just has one inlet, much larger diameter. It can run cooler, and they went from a ball bearing to a journal style bearing, which is similar to what you have on your crank and your cam bearings. There was also failures with the valves breaking on the previous generation, so we have much stronger valve train, we have much stronger heads. We even had a substantial update to the EGR system, so we have a better EGR cooler and different engine tuning to allow those components to be a little bit more reliable. Now, some things that you can watch for on these older Power Strokes, it was common to have the radiators leaking, which we have a new radiator on this one. What would happen is the seal between the metal housing and the plastic portion of the radiator, so between the core and the end caps, would get a leak, and it was most commonly on the driver's side. You could look underneath, look at that frame rail, and you would find the leak down there. Now, one of the components that didn't change was the lift pump fuel system. So if you're buying one of these, I do recommend changing that lift pump, going with the fast fuel system. Now, they did upgrade the CP4. They did make the part a little bit better to handle the higher fuel pressure that they were directing towards the injectors on this truck. Now, the crankcase filter still remained the same. So I'd recommend if you're purchasing one of these, make sure that crankcase filter is updated. They did not change the charged air cooler tube, so I'd make sure that you replace that tube either with the updated Ford style or going with something aftermarket. One of the big features we gained by swapping the turbo is we ended up removing a turbo that had a wastegate on it and going to a turbo that had a more robust VGT system on it. It allowed the introduction of the exhaust brake. So on the 15 and 16 model, you do have a button that you can press and get some retarding power from the turbo by closing the vanes and getting you some back pressure. So looking at this truck, this is exactly where I see the issue. You can see right here where this ring has already moved about ½ an inch off of where it's supposed to be seating. So this one is on its way to coming off. So it's definitely an item I recommend repairing. That is a super simple part to swap out, but it's easy to be left on the side of the road when that thing blows apart. So one of the really big benefits to the 11 to 16 model, outside of the powertrain, the body is made out of steel. The bodies are very simple, and the electronic systems on these trucks are very simple. So if you can bulletproof some stuff in the engine bay, it's very easy to get 1,000,000 miles out of these trucks. The axles are strong and the bodies are very strong. Now, when we jump forward to the third generation, this generation was primarily updates to the body. That was where the majority of the changes came. Now, we do have some small engine changes that I'll talk about, but we changed the frame, the suspension, and the body. And the biggest difference I see between these two trucks, powertrain wise, they're almost identically reliable, but I much prefer driving the 17 to 19 model than I do the steel body, just because these trucks ride so much better. So one, they're more aerodynamic. They're a lot quieter inside the cab. Ford actually changed how the front door meets up to the cab. So the front door is now recessed behind the A-pillar, versus these older trucks, the door actually crawls over the A-pillar. So you get a lot more wind noise out of the steel body than you do the aluminum. And then the cab mount bushings. If you're looking at a steel body truck, the cab bushings are prone to compressing and wearing out and giving a lot of squeaks. These aluminum body trucks did not have that issue. Another one of my big favorites that they upgraded were the headlights, especially with the LEDs. You went from driving with the old dim yellow headlights to getting something that was much brighter. So you had two bulbs working at one time, plus if you have the LED options, they were extremely bright. Now this color, this white gold and caribou, actually had a 2017 model in this exact color. This was my favorite color that Ford ever made. They made it for 2017 and about 2/4 of 2018, and then they stopped production on it. I don't know why. We sold a ton of these trucks. All these trucks have been sitting outside in the rain and the dust, and honestly, it is probably the cleanest looking one that I have out here. It just does a really good job of hiding that dust. So the Illuma Duty had a big jump in power. We gained 10 horsepower to 450, but we gained a lot more torque. They pushed this thing up to 935 pounds of torque. So if you're towing trailers, there is a substantial difference in the towing power of this truck. Now the engine and the transmission are almost identical. There's very few little changes, just some little nuts and bolts and little parts here and there, but otherwise the engine and powertrain is almost identical. But my favorite feature that they did on the Illuma Duty is they added a cabin filter. Not having a cabin filter on the steel body trucks is probably my least favorite option that we're missing, because if you're working out of your truck and you're getting those cabs dirty and full of dirt, you're going to have to pull the dash and either replace or clean that evaporator core, because it'll be completely plugged up. On the 2017 and newer trucks, they all have a cabin filter located behind the glove box in the dash. It's a simple part to swap it out every oil change or every so often, depending on how much dust you're getting inside the cab. Now these trucks were not completely bulletproof from the factory. If you're looking at buying one of these, especially if it has 100,000 miles or more, there's still a list of options that I would recommend upgrading, because it's items that we would see in for service quite often. So the 17 to 19 model is still running the same lift pump system that we had all the way back to 2011. So I would recommend upgrading that lift pump system with a fast fuel system, get better fuel supply up to the engine bay, and easier serviceability with the filters. If you have one that's over 100,000 miles, there's a good chance that that thing has probably been replaced at some point. Crankcase filter is also another item that did not get updated, and we saw a lot of oil leaks on the upper oil pan out of these trucks, and most of the time it was due to crankcase pressure. So if the owner of the truck would have known to simply swap that part, it would have been very easy to get that thing upgraded. Now the charged air cooler tube on these was upgraded, and here's a prime example. It was upgraded, but it is still not bulletproof. So this one has 86,000 miles, and you can see this big crack right here in the boot. So this one I'm going to recommend putting a new boot on. So there was a big upgrade here in the fact that they removed the plastic that was getting hot and essentially ballooning out. They replaced it with rubber, but the quality of the rubber is still not great. You could get 2 or 3 years out of this, but just the time of that rubber dry rotting creates a weak point. The radiators were still a little bit problematic, so if you're looking at buying one of these, double check that radiator. If it looks like it's leaking, just know you're gonna have some expense there. In 2017, there was some suspension alignment modifications to make these trucks steer a little bit better. So you had the option of adaptive steering, and Ford was trying to get that steering very soft. And what I noticed was, starting in 2018, the caster angle actually was reduced close to a 2 degree on a lot of these new trucks, especially the higher trim level. If you went up into a King Ranch or a Platinum, they were trying to make them steer so easy they had removed that caster angle, which reduces that return to center force, makes the steering easier. And we ran into a lot of trucks that had death wobble issues. So my recommendation on the steering components, either replace the radius arms with a Carly adjustable caster radius arm, get a drop bracket, put caster shims in, but try to get the caster back to around the 4.5 degree mark, and that'll make the steering components last a whole lot longer. We also found some dampers on these that were failing prematurely, so make sure you have a good steering damper. As far as a cost of ownership and a simplicity rating, I would say the 17 to 19 model would be my favorite generation because of those two categories. You can buy these at a relatively affordable price. There's not a whole lot of bulletproofing you have to do. If it hasn't had all the items done, you may spend a few $1,000s to upgrade some of those components, but the truck is still relatively simple. Although we got a major cab improvement, there wasn't a huge jump in technology. So we jump up to the 4th generation, which is the 2020 model to 2022 model. And this is my personal truck. It is a 2020 model with 202,000 miles. So the biggest thing that I like about my truck was the upgrade to the 10-speed transmission. And I know I'm gonna get some hate mail on the 10-speed because it doesn't appear to be as reliable as a 6-speed, is what a lot of people will tell you. But honestly, I had more trouble with my 6-speed than I did with my 10-speed. So I've got 202,000 miles on my 10-speed. What I've found on the 10-speed is there's 2 things you have to do to make sure that transmission lasts a long time. One of them is service. So you need to service that transmission fluid every 45 to 60,000 miles. And service, I mean, flush the fluid out, put a new filter in it, and make sure that fluid stays extremely clean. And then if you ever get to the point where the transmission is shifting unusual, you need to make sure and get it in and reset that adaptive learn, go back through the relearn process, and normally you can fix any of those issues. If you continue to drive with a flared shift, a hard downshift, a skip shift, it's going to cause clutch damage and you'll be back into the shop for probably a transmission rebuild. Now, there was a small error, and I believe it was around the late 20 models or early 2021 models. There was a planetary gear recall. A lot of those transmissions blew up right out of the box. If not, they came back in for the planetary recall. Probably about 50% of them we would end up putting a new transmission in or replacing the planetary gear based on what we found. But besides that little hiccup, I really like the 10-speed better. This truck will definitely move a lot more weight down the road. So we had a significant increase in towing from the steel body to the aluminum duty, and another big jump when we got to that 10-speed transmission because we could keep those transmission temps lower. We could keep the RPM range where maximum torque was, and it just moved loads so much easier down the road. We also find that that 10-speed transmission will give these trucks just a little bit better of a fuel mileage because we can keep that RPM range right there where the max torque is. So the 4th generation had major improvements from front to back. So the body didn't change a whole lot. We got a new interior and a new grille. So for a lot of people, they don't see much of a difference except for the 10-speed transmission, but this truck is wildly improved compared to the 19 model. The biggest factor on this newer generation, the 6.7, is the entire rotating assembly in the engine was improved. Better components, stronger components, so that they could add horsepower because this truck hit the ground with 475 horsepower and 1,050 pounds of torque. So to increase that horsepower, they upgraded things like the fuel system. So our lift pump in the back is drastically better. We now have a sump inside the fuel tank that is supplying fuel to an external filter housing that is twice the size of what you got on the previous generation. We see much less problems out of that lift pump delivery system. The filters are bigger and do a much better job of catching contamination. We increased the durability of the CP4 pump. They produce a lot more PSI. Now, in doing that, they did switch injectors, and so fuel filter maintenance on this truck is extremely important because the fuel injectors on this truck have a 0 tolerance for any type of debris. Even just a smallest amount of debris that gets into your fuel system during a fuel filter change can cause an injector to clog up. Now, when we go to the engine bay, a lot of the things that we had problems with on the 19 and older trucks, like valves breaking, a big one was exhaust components breaking, so exhaust studs. You got much bigger studs, up pipe studs. The EGR stud on the up pipe is bigger. We went to a 14 millimeter versus a 10 millimeter. There's horror stories of those 10 millimeters breaking. Anybody that tries to repair one or remove that exhaust gas recirculation up pipe that comes off the exhaust manifold, extremely common for those things to break. When you get to the 2020 model, all of those little things that were causing technicians, heck, back there in the shop, things that would break while they're trying to do service, a lot of those items were addressed. We got a better charged air cooler tube, we got a better radiator, so I see a lot less radiator leaks out of these. We got a little bit of an improvement on the CCV filter, but I do recommend, even on these 2020s, upgrading to that 2023 Plus CCV filter, which is much, much smaller. It allows the gases to get through. It probably doesn't filter as well as the older ones do, but that's really not the issue. What we don't want happening is we don't want that thing building pressure and causing oil leaks. Now, one of the downsides to the 2020 and newer truck is they put a variable speed oil pump, which is great in the fact that we can build lower oil pressure, or we can build higher oil pressure at lower RPMs and then balance that oil pressure out at the higher RPMs. So if you do have to do an oil pan reseal or a front cover reseal, typically involves pulling the cab and taking the engine out, or you really have to get that engine way up off the bottom of the frame of the truck to have access to the oil pan, because the oil pan can no longer just slide straight backwards. It has to go down about 3 inches before it can come back. After having a large number of trucks coming in with a death wobble on the 2018 and 2019 year models, we did see a big improvement in the front end suspension on the 2020 truck. So one, we went back to having close to a 3.5 or 4 degree caster on the trucks straight from the factory. So we saw about a 1.5 degree increase. We found stronger tie rods. We did have a small damper issue where we had some damper recalls, but the dampers were improved once we got through that that recall period. Because these trucks had more horsepower, it requires more cooling. So we did see that the fan clutch on these would engage into the high position at a lower temperature. So you could run these trucks a little bit harder, especially in those summer temps and climbing mountains. When you're hauling those big loads, the 2020 and newer would run about 8 degrees cooler than my 17 model did with the exact same trailer. My 17 model was a little bit easier for me to overheat than my 2020 model was. Now the 2020 model does have quite a few more electronic options that you can get in the different configurations. So there's a little bit more of a dynamic electrical system on them. So some of the do-it-yourself at home items are a little bit more challenging on this truck because the CAN bus networks are a lot more complicated. There's a lot more modules on this truck than there were on the 19 model just previously before. And probably the biggest failure point that I see with the electronic system is the battery junction box. If you do not do a good job of keeping that fuse box cover lid on, it is common for water to come down off the A-pillar, drip inside, and get into that fuse box, which will cause the truck not to start, not to turn off, all kinds of weird electronic issues, which can be avoided. It's not that the design is completely terrible if you make sure and keep that cover on, but we do see a lot of those come in because the covers get knocked loose during servicing. Somebody leaves the cover loose trying to put a fuse in there, and the DEF system on these is much better. So all the way back to 2011, we have had DPF filters and diesel exhaust fluid in use. Now from the 2011 through the 2019, they used about the same amount of DEF. So most of our customers would go about 6,000 miles before they'd refill the DEF tank. When we got to 2020, emission rules had increased, and we would see these trucks use anywhere from a DEF tank about every 3,000 to 5,000 miles. So almost twice the usage, not terrible. You know, filling up one time between oil change isn't a big deal. But what I liked about the DEF system and the exhaust system on this truck is it was a lot more reliable. We saw much fewer trucks coming in with clogged filters because the regen cycle was done a lot more often. They cut it into a lot smaller pieces versus the 11 to 14 trucks. When those things would go into a regen, you would feel the truck bogged down. 15, 16 model got a little bit better, but even on my 17 model, if that thing would go into a regen of the exhaust system, you would feel the truck bogged down. A lot of times you'd even get a pop-up message that it's cleaning. On the 2020 newer trucks, you really never even noticed. If the truck was sitting idling, it would self-high idle, start the cleaning process, and the DEF pumps were so much better. We replaced a lot of DEF pumps on all of these first three generation trucks. 2020 to 2022, we still replaced some DEF pumps, but it was at a much lower rate. I'm talking probably 15% of the rate that we did on those older trucks. So if you're looking for one to save some money and you're trying to decide between the first and second era of this IllumiDuty, I always prefer the 2020 and newer over these 2017 to 2019 just because of the power and drivability and some of those additional strengths they added under the engine bay. So I don't have an exact favorite, but I have favorites in categories. So if you're looking for simplicity, I would say the third generation, this 2017 to 2019, would probably be my favorite. Now, as far as drivability, I bump up to the 20 to 2022 model because we keep a lot of the components that we have on the first generation IllumiDuty as far as simplicity of some of the electronics. Now, we added a lot more drivability improvements. The 10-speed transmission and the upgraded 6.7 to me drive so much better that I prefer this one over that 17 to 19. Now, the newest version, our fifth generation, is going to be the 2023 and newer trucks. So we took all of this research that we found on all these trucks in the first four generations, the failure points, problems in service, and Ford did an extremely good job of fixing many problems front to back. So we knew Ford was sandbagging us a little bit with those horsepower numbers on the last generation, so they came out and gave us the high output with 500 horsepower and 1,200 foot-pounds of torque. So if you want to move a massive heavy trailer down the road, these trucks will do it with ease. The increase in towing capacity from that first generation to this one is huge, thousands and thousands of pounds. So let's start with some of the major improvements. You know, we thought they did a really good job getting to this point. How could they make it even better? Let's talk about some of those details. So inside the engine bay, we've added a lot of horsepower and a lot of torque. So we have to increase the cooling capacity of this truck. To this day, I have not seen any issues with the radiators on these brand new trucks. So they've fixed the radiator manufacturing process. They're getting better seals. Because these trucks have more horsepower and more torque, they create a lot more heat. There is a major change in the way the cooling fan works. So these cooling fans will have multiple speeds and you will hear them engage. So if you're hauling a heavy trailer, it's not uncommon to hear it on the middle speed, hear it on the high speed, and when that thing kicks on high, those temps will drop from 225 back down to 205 in an instant. So if you're climbing hills, these trucks will definitely stay cooler than any of the generations before it. Once again, any weak point that they found in the engine, they have updated engine internals, they've updated the emission system drastically on these. So emission systems are always a problem with every brand. It's something that nobody wants on there, but yet we have it. And when they go bad, it's expensive to fix them. So one of the things that they did on this truck that I really like is they moved the diesel injection to the DPF filter through a 9th injector that is actually down there on the downpipe. So now when these trucks regen, instead of sending diesel through the exhaust stroke of the piston, through the exhaust stroke of the cylinder, going through the exhaust valve, down the manifold, through the turbo, into the downpipe, into the DPF, and heat soaking all those components, they've eliminated all the wear and tear on the valve train, the turbo, the exhaust manifolds, and now they inject diesel right there at the DPF filter. And these DPF filters clean cycles are a lot more robust, so they're more sensitive to changes in pressure, temperature, and driving habits. We see much fewer clogged exhaust filters on these newest generations than I have on any of them in the past. The EGR systems are more robust to prevent clogging, prevent overheating, prevent cracking of studs, and the DEF pumps have also been more reliable on these newer trucks. Really, the only thing that I see more repairs on these newer trucks than the older ones are the technology, and it's a good and bad thing. Some of it is required by the government, a lot of it is pushed by customer demand. If one manufacturer comes out with an option, all of them want to come out with the same option to compete, and so all the manufacturers are dealing with all kinds of different electronic issues. And a lot of it is not necessarily the electronic is bad, it's that we're always working on updates. So there may be a regulation that changes or your iPhone updates, and so the internal components of the truck have to constantly load updates. And that's probably one of the bigger repair items that we see. But as far as the truck, this is definitely the best diesel truck on the market by far, both in reliability, in ride quality, and in power. So some people will comment on Ford about, hey, they have more recalls than everybody else. That means they're building a lower quality truck. Not actually the case. Ford really cares about having good quality in their vehicle. So if they find an issue, instead of bearing the issue and just making the customer deal with it down the road, they do issue a lot of recalls. And many of those recalls are simply just programming updates that say, hey, we built this truck and a year down the road, now we have millions of customers in the truck and we have the data to support that we're having some issues. So we're going to release a software update to fix some issues. Most of those recalls that come in, less than 1% of my customers ever have the issues that are associated with the recalls, but we do the recalls as a preventative measure to make sure they have the best ownership experience. Ford recently was announced #1 in initial quality, so that means when these trucks roll it out of the shop, how many issues do they have? Because there is lots of vehicles built, and Ford's not exempt, that from day one, out of the line, they're at the dealer's lot, getting items repaired, and you hate to see that. Ford has worked extremely hard at hiring really capable engineers to build these trucks and eliminate problems as fast as possible. Now, because technology is always changing and customers are always demanding something new, we're never going to be with a perfect truck that doesn't have problems, because with new technology comes new problems. But I'm really impressed at the way Ford has kept on with this 6.7, and they just have continually made really great changes with it over the years. And if you're looking for a truck, I hope this helps. Whether you're buying new or used, you'll know the differences between all the generations, between the facts and the fiction, and be able to make a good purchase decision for yourself. If you like the content, make sure and click that follow button so you'll receive some more.